Tullinguulluni sarpummiisussaavoq Lars Jensen. Hej. Lars Jensen qutaqutariva maana paasisimalerparput Danmarkip Nunarput nunasiaatigisimagaa qanga Nunarput nunasiaataajunnaarpa. Lars ilisimatuiuoq nunasiaateqarnerup kingorna pissutsinut. Cultural Encounters Roskilde Universitemi sulisuuoq. Lars illu sungiffimine wombat spotting this wombatinik ujarleruyorneq nuannarisarivaa aamadu apatanado gaffimik liisapornimi imerujornissani nuannarisarallu. Lars tekenna.
And apologies beforehand if I say anything in Greenlandic, it will sound absolutely non-Greenlandic, I'm sure, but at least the intention is there, let's say. In case I couldn't sort of obviously understand the last bit because I'd taken the headphones off, but if she was referring to drinking abatanados in Lisbon, then I can just say go down to Katuaq and have a svendip down there because that's actually the same sort of coffee. So this talk I'm going to do is going to be a sort of slightly sprawling talk that will cover a lot of, in a way, the kind of discussions and conversations that I could see we're going to have in the space of this afternoon. I hope it makes sense because obviously that was my intention, but it's in a way trying not to sort of go too deeply into the archives. I could speak to those, of course, but in some ways I think I have sort of this feeling that we already know what's in the archives by now. And it's not looking pretty, what's in the archives. So I sort of took the opportunity to try to become a little bit more broad-ranging in what I'm doing. This should take probably maybe about 30 minutes, so I hope that since I've got 45, more like 40 minutes now, that's all right. Hopefully there'll be a little bit of chance for people to ask a couple of questions, so if there's anything you want me to go a little bit further into, I'll do that. And I will also read slowly also for the benefit of to give the translator a chance to get it across the board. So let me begin my talk by thanking the organizers for inviting me and for having the thought that I might have something interesting to contribute to this important conference. I would actually like to dedicate my talk to two parties, both of which are relevant to my topic. I don't mean political parties here. The first one is to Indigenous Australian journalist Dan Grant. Let's see if I can get this one to work. Is that one? Or? No, that one? Yep, there he is. Who had to take leave from his job at the ABC, which is the Australian television equivalent of KNR in Greenland, or Danmarks Radio in Denmark. He had to take leave from his job at the ABC because of the barrage of vitriolic hate directed at him and his family after he spoke about the historical and ongoing effect on Indigenous Australians when he was commenting on the coronation of poor old Charlie in May. I mean, poor old Charlie, of course, referring to the new king in the UK. What Grant did was basically argue that the introduction of one sovereignty was the violation of another, a pre-existing one, which actually, according to the literature on sovereignty, constitutes a violation and is hence illegal. This also happens to be the view of the Australian High Court. Grant became caught up in what the author Margaret Simons described as, and I quote here, what looks like objectivity to white journalists looks very different to those who are, to quote Grant, on the other side of history, unquote. I would hate to think this applies in a Greenlandic Danish context to journalists, politicians, academics, let alone anyone speaking of the Danish monarchy's involvement in colonizing Greenland, and of course the same monarchy's involvement in enslavement in the US Virgin Islands. I was thinking about this when I was walking from my hotel yesterday past Prinsessevej, Dronning Ingridvej. And isn't it funny that where most cities have a ring road, Nuuk must be the only one that has a rink road. So in respect of Stan Grant's wish when he stood aside from the ABC that he didn't ask for or necessarily think he deserved support because he recognized his own privileged position as a highly profiled mainstream journalist. I would like to dedicate my talk also to all Indigenous Australians, and particularly those who have fought so hard to bring forward the case of an Indigenous voice to Parliament since the Uluru Statement from the Heart in 2017. If you're interested, I can elaborate on this in question time, perhaps for those who are not familiar with that, but there's lots of here that has ramifications for what we're talking about here. That voice to Parliament in Australia is now heading for a referendum as it requires a change to the Australian Constitution. Sound familiar? The Indigenous Australian case is about sovereignty, as our conversation here today is about sovereignty. Just as it is about the fact that until sovereignty is achieved, there can be no end to colonialism. And if there is no end to colonialism, there is no end to racism, including settler colonial Australians and Danes here in Kalalit Nunat and over in Denmark, who will continue to think that solutions to Indigenous Australian and Greenlandic problems can only come from settler colonial Australians and Danes. Whiteness and blindness go hand in hand. Otherwise, one would have thought they would have realized the problems were the result of earlier white interventions by themselves. So why reappoint the same people who have made the early mistakes to fix the problem? Then, of course, the backdrop for this conference is the 70th anniversary of the annexation of Greenland and the Faroe Islands to Denmark. I noticed that it was used in a press release also. I used the term annexation to highlight how undemocratic and in complete contravention of the UN's principle of colonized people's right to self-determination that process was, as demonstrated in Anne-Christine Hermann's book and in my books, speaking of which. I know I'm kind of here as an academic today, but I'm also sort of here as a non-academic, and I'm also here to speak my mind, but also to speak from my heart. But I have sort of these publications that I made over the years that will be kind of slightly referenced in what I'm saying here, and I'm just going to leave them behind for someone. I hope they find a space where multiple people can get access to them, of course. So what was uncovered was not particularly difficult to uncover. I mean, what Herman and what I uncovered in my book about the transition in 1953 was actually not particularly well hidden, I thought. So it's not difficult to uncover. So why has this not been taken up generally by scholars in the relevant fields? That's more my question. Is there a pattern to the Danish Greenlandic establishment's paving over, ignoring and or silencing of these unpalatable chapters in a supposedly common history? A strategy that seeks to avoid rocking the boat by constantly fixing the gaze on the future and disconnecting the past from the present. In the broader public realm outside academia, it also took decade upon decade before it has begrudgingly at best been recognized as an absolutely typical form of European, and in this case, Danish colonial rule. I signal the European because you can just look at how blatantly the French have worked to avoid real self-determination in its supposedly former colonial territories in the Indo-Pacific. Jens Dahl raised this simple question in his Arctic Selvstyre from 1986. How come we so openly in Denmark see and condemn French colonialism in the Pacific, yet don't see our own? I also signal the connections between various European colonial practices and attitudes decades after the end of the colonial era. I mean here in a historical sense, using the colonial era as a kind of formal colonial rule, just to make that absolutely clear. To point out how there is nothing particularly exceptional about Danish rule over Greenland, not during what went before the modernization period, nor in what followed. And this, of course, is where colonialism begins to tap deeply into Danish national self-perceptions. And this, in my view, sits at the core of why it is so difficult to shift the Danish attitude from its white supremacist colonial logic. Often we tend to think of Danish reluctance to face Greenlandic desires for independence simply with reference to Danish interest in the Arctic. But I think what is also at stake here is the Danish need to be seen to be altruistic, to be benevolent, to be worthy of promoting universal Danish values and export them to the rest of the world through, for instance, development aid. So, in other words, not an either-or, but a both-and situation, interests and self-perception going, in this case, hand in hand. So this brings me to the point of the importance to scrutinize what took place during the supposed post-colonial Danish rule in Greenland from 1953 to 1979, but not to do so in isolation, but with a keen attention to what happens when nasty policies from the modernization period escape into the open. The most recent, I guess, is the scandal of the IUD, what's known here as spiralkampagne, or in Danish known as spiralkampagne, the birth control campaign. The question I would ask here is why we can be surprised, as we have long known about what is now referred to as the experiment in the 1950s, early 1950s, when these kids from Greenland were taken to Denmark. In other words, there is a pattern here, both in what the modernization period actually was and what it entailed. But my point is there is also a pattern to the repeated shock over revelations, just as there is a pattern in the repeated lack of consequences for the parties involved and for what repercussions such a past must have for the renegotiated Greenlandic-Danish relation in the present. The Danish Prime Minister's apology to the children is not irrelevant and may represent a moment of closure for the survivors. But it points to a far deeper question of how Denmark ruled over Greenland in a system that remained colonial and hence racialized. And I would argue continue to pop up in those forms. In my 2 books on post-colonial Denmark, you can go and look that up. In that book, I reference, for instance, the 2008 debate in Folketinget, the Danish Parliament, on asylum seekers, where one of the members of Parliament said we cannot have people coming off the ice cap to decide Danish policy. And then, of course, most of us in the room probably are familiar with the 2019 situation, Greenland as Africa on ice, which helped Denmark avoid a buffoon of a prime minister. But how did the other Danish politicians actually respond to Pape's idiotic statement? I think that is where we need to look. So the issues briefly outlined above are not directly related to sovereignty at the end of colonialism, yet they are completely fundamental to understanding how Danish rule over Greenland may go through its phases, but we shouldn't mistake those phases for a lack of pattern. And that pattern is about pretending to work alongside Greenland and the Faroe Islands, while in reality it is about continuing Danish rule over and in Greenland, for the sake of preserving its position as an Arctic power, but also for the sake of preserving its idealized self-image. From helping extend landing strips at airports to maintaining the status of Danish language as the master language. So, who am I? I stand here as a teacher and researcher who has spent a few decades examining colonialism and its aftermath in numerous places, I would like to say. I also stand here as myself a white Dane, though I don't subscribe to Danishness in any shape or form. Today I'm hopeful I don't come across as one of those who stridently defend, who implicitly defend, or who tries to be your friend without taking the necessary steps to deserve your friendship. What has brought me here is also a number of conversations that I've had with friends about what I typically label as the Greenlandic-Danish relation over a steadily rising number of years. I owe everyone in this community that I've been privileged to be part of a big thank you. You helped me way more than you could ever think. I also wonder, though not really, Why I have not even found a handful of Danish academics to have these conversations with. I hope you're listening out there. I don't think that we sent the worst Danes to Greenland from the beginning of the modernization period, nor do I think we sent the most talented. But I think those who came and continue to come here traveled with a self-perception of natural entitlement. That is the legacy of having been undisputed rulers. Similar to how, for example, Portuguese people saw themselves when they migrated to Angola and Mozambique during the global financial crisis when the economy in Portugal collapsed. A very, very similar pattern of attitude and what they thought they were doing there, how they were treated by the locals and what their sense of entitlement was, etc. So because we have taken so long to begin to talk about colonialism, not as a sort of weird period happening outside our national identity formation, but as a form of oppression, of subjugation, that made us feel good about ourselves as Danes, in fact helped define what it meant to be Danish, European, and naturally superior. This made us feel so good that we came up with all kinds of mythologies, justifying our presence out there and up here. It was such a good feeling that it became entrenched in us as Danes. You may think not that many Danes came up here, or have come up here out of the Danish population as a whole. I would argue, in contrast to that mentally we all came here. Because Greenland operated as a cultural archive, justifying to ourselves who we were and are, and we were and are good. If we were bad and did things wrong, you will note there is no identification of who was bad or what was done wrong. The bad of the past is used as a smoke mirror to demonstrate how we have become good. And that, I think, also includes the Danish Prime Minister's apology to the Greenlandic children who are now pensioners, those who are still alive. These days, Denmark is wannabe world champions at whatever we touch, from sports over COVID handling to human rights defenders, renewables and democracy upholders to protectors of our unique welfare society. At least on the sports front, we occasionally actually lift the trophy. On the other fronts, we are undermining, I would argue, and destroying while we claim to work to do the opposite. In that sense, I think there's a very clear correlation between the way in which Denmark handles its relationship to Greenland and how Denmark handles its relationship with its migrant population. So in this field, there is consistency in how Danish policy is practiced at home and in Greenland. The resulting schizophrenic relationship between Denmark and Greenland, orchestrated by Danes, is, I think, caught beautifully in Julius' marvelous straitjacket as a form of mutual self-entrapment, where Danes know that we must leave, but we cannot leave because of what it provides for us in terms of national grandeur, inflated global self-importance. Greenland has become Denmark's Hotel California. This is one reason why Lars Løkke Rasmussen couldn't appoint a Greenlander as Arctic ambassador. And it furthermore explains why he couldn't let himself be confronted by it. Note how the Danish and media and the Danish Greenlandic academic establishment may have picked out the arrogance of his approach, but failed to identify the profoundness of the arrogance. So I'm just going to show you a slide here because that one we might just skip, but I can talk to that later. But obviously it's about, where are we in history? How come it repeats itself type of thing. But that one, which I actually spent a sizable amount of time putting together because I'm not really good with these things. And the ambassadors kept sliding down the slide, so I had to sort of put them up there again. But they're kind of slippery people tend to be, I suppose. That's the nature of the game, isn't it? But I thought I wanted to take it seriously. He said, Lars Løkke Rasmussen said, well, in Denmark we don't appoint ambassadors on the condition of their ethnicity. And then I thought, I want to see the color scheme of these ambassadors. There are 3 Larses, by the way, among those up there, I think also. And they're not all there, but I've not sort of stripped away, selected ones that look different, right? So that's a very kind of representative way of looking at what Danish diplomacy looks like, and explains quite a lot of things, I think. Okay, so I know I was invited here to speak about the 70-year period since the annexation that went on the scene and backstage. So let me turn to make some observations about this. 1953, 1979, 2009 appear like pearls on a string. Each pearl signaling another step in the direction of self-determination as stipulated by the UN and is desired by the vast majority of Greenlanders, and often celebrated by Danes as a Danish gift, as evidence of Danish grace, of Danish benevolence, and the success of the Danish civilizing mission. There is a counter-narrative, of course, to the rigsfællesskab's community discourse, that every new pearl on that string represents another Danish moment of attempting to procrastinate its rule, to prolong eternally its rule over Greenland. These 2 narratives are perhaps less polarized than might immediately seem to be the case. The straitjacket I mentioned earlier can both be seen from a Danish, from a Greenlandic, and from a relational perspective, or a game of chess, where Danes seek to avoid more self-determination, Greenlanders seek to achieve more, and the relational is the give and take arrangement. The latter may be a fairly accurate description of what's going on, but what are the power relations which determine what game we're playing? How many pieces we actually have on the chessboard? And then there is the question of the national self-perception. Let me ask a simple question. Can anyone think of a Dane with influence in this power game who advocates for more self-determination for Greenlanders? Can anyone think of a Greenlander who wants less self-determination for Greenlanders than Danes? And if someone out there is thinking, but what are those Danes who say, let them have their independence, we will just leave? Don't make me laugh. They don't mean it. What they're after is a return to the modernization period. And their argument is not only about Greenland, but tied directly to fantasies of an exclusively white-ruled Denmark at home and abroad. And then I think I need to say something briefly about sovereignty. Like the Greenlandic-Danish relationship, sovereignty also comes with a straitjacket, or perhaps several. One dimension is that sovereignty in itself is a Eurocentric term, because it is rooted in domestic European history and because it served as an instrument in European colonialism. How it was and still is conceivable that someone can get in a boat in England, sail to the other end of the globe and claim a place, declare it uninhabited, while the locals who have been there for 60,000 years stand around, remains a mystery to me. But as a colonial power practice of taking land from its rightful occupants and declare it yours, with reference to a concept of sovereignty that is completely meaningless to the people and delivered in a language they don't know, it makes perfect sense because it's part of a pattern. And that pattern is about colonialism and its accompanying racialization. To talk about sovereignty then is to ask a question about how political judicial practice, geopolitics and international law shape the conditions of a future sovereignty, such as the one Kalalit Nunat is looking for. But to be a sovereign subject, in, for example, the words of Indigenous Australian researcher Eileen Moreton-Robinson, is about something more than the Eurocentric definitions of sovereignty I spoke to before. It is to recognize that you cannot be alienated from your land, because land is kin, land is who you are, what you think, what you believe in. It defines you. This may seem an example of how utterly incompatible European, for example, British and Danish, ways of thinking sovereignty is to Indigenous Australia or Greenland, perhaps better, in this case, Inuit, ways of thinking sovereignty. But that is to miss the point of colonialism and its racist underpinnings. You are not alienated from your land or from your culture. Someone uses something to alienate you. Colonialism is about dispossession, to pave the way pave the way for what Morrison Robertson called the white possessive. So sovereignty at the end of Danish colonial rule is about taking back control over your country, Nunarput, right? But it is not only about being in control of your political and economic destiny, because what waits there is the world as we know it. The world disorder as we know it's shaped by hundreds of years of colonial control and imperial control, and now in its most recent form of neoliberal globalization. Sovereignty has to be about looking for a different way forward, where the destiny of Kalaallit Nunaat is shaped both by taking full control of its political and economic structures, but sovereignty is also about redefining what it means to do this in a way that does justice to Inuit ways of knowing, that foregrounds this production of knowledge and continues to decolonize the Danish presence and legacy physically and mentally. So, I'm getting towards the very end here. I would have been quite happy to talk about the challenges out there in the form of the world disorder inside which we live. US, China, Russia, you know the drill. And even more happy to talk about the schizophrenic Danish international politics. Greenlanders, be aware of the American interests. Those same Americans that Danes trust unconditionally with safeguarding their own future. But I would like to finish by briefly revisiting one of those future scenarios envisioned for a huge country like Greenland, the 12th biggest country in the world, but with one of the world's smallest populations. And, by the way, of course, destined to deliver at least 0.5 meter of global sea rise before the next century, beginning of the next century. I'm talking about the free association idea. Interesting concept, but of course with its own colonial history. The first mention refers to French colonial territories in Indochina. We all know what that meant and where that went. In its more contemporary arrangement, I would be less interested in the US Pacific Island model. I'm naturally a bit skeptical about the Americans sometimes. And I'd be more interested in the South Pacific islands of Niue and Cook Islands, where particular parts of state structures may be outsourced or perhaps held at some collective mutually obligated level. For Kalaallit Nunaat, this could potentially, of course, involve Denmark, once Denmark has recognized, worked for reconciliation or reparation, in other words, demonstrated in practice what it likes to put in words. It is not that there is an absence of global power operations in the Pacific. The rivalry between the US and China is more prominent there than it is in the Arctic. Yet the rivalry in itself provides opportunities for negotiating better deals. And finally, finishing off the talk, of course, by talking about Cook Islands, it brings us back to the beginning of my talk when I talked about the English captain heading to Australia, who, of course, was Captain Cook. Hoyanak, I've got a couple of slides more that I am not really going to talk to, but it's just to, it's some of the sort of stuff that has been going on. And again, I'm talking to an audience that is so clued into all these discussions. So it's a bit pointless to me to start talking to that, because you'll know possibly even more about it than I do. And this one is just kind of trying to say a little bit about what's at stake in revisiting the constitutional past. So it's kind of going a little bit over the territory that I've been covering here in my talk. So let's have a moment of reading. It's like a church, isn't it? And then that one. We all want to know about the future, don't we? All right, so by my count, we've got about 12 minutes for questions, which is not too badly done, I thought. Yep, well, huyanak for the time being, but like I said...
Lars, nu rører noget så. Men sikkert bifisaqararpu napeqqitiqartiqarsinnaani saanut. Bifisarpu massik apeqqitissanut, apeqqitinut, apeqqitisaqartiqassappat. Arlarsmaaniitisi